At the beginning of the 14th century, people did not die suddenly. They faded away slowly. Bread began to disappear from the tables, crops rotted in the fields before they could be harvested, and hunger entered homes without making a sound. Families went to sleep believing they would survive the winter and woke up too weak to stand. There were no visible wounds, no blood in the streets, only bodies growing thinner day by day, and cities becoming strangely quiet. Before the Black Death, before mass graves and the terror history remembers, Europe was already dying. And almost no one noticed. Hunger does not arrive like an explosion. It seeps in. First, the bread grows smaller. Then the price rises. And soon, silence begins to occupy places once full of life. At first, few understood what was happening. Poor harvests had happened before. Harsh winters were nothing new. Medieval Europe believed it would pass. But it did not. As the months went by, daily life began to change. Markets grew quiet. Baskets stood empty. Conversations faded, not because people had nothing to say, but because they no longer had the strength to speak. In villages, the smell of freshly baked bread vanished. In cities, silent lines formed outside closed bakeries. Along the roads, people began to appear, walking without direction, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Hunger did not choose its victims quickly. It weakened them. It drained them, and it waited. Children stopped playing. Adults lost the strength in their arms. The elderly simply sat down and never stood up again. Nights grew longer. Sleep became restless. And a question spread quietly from house to house, whispered but never spoken aloud. What if this never ends? To understand how Europe reached this point, we must look at the world that existed before the famine. The early 14th century was not a time of decline. On the contrary, Europe was living the height of the High Middle Ages. For generations, the climate had been favorable. The period now known as the medieval warm period had provided abundant and reliable harvests, allowing the population to grow rapidly. In just 2 centuries, Europe's population nearly doubled. Forests were cleared. Lands once considered marginal were brought under cultivation. Every possible piece of soil was used. Cities like Paris, London, Florence, and Venice expanded beyond their ancient walls, becoming dense, noisy, overcrowded centers of life. Medieval society believed it had found a lasting balance with nature. But that balance was fragile. Everything began to collapse with the sky. In the spring of 1315, relentless rains struck much of Western Europe. These were not passing storms, but weeks of continuous rainfall, months without enough sunlight to dry the land. Fields became waterlogged. Wheat rotted before it could ripen. Barley failed to sprout. Hay, essential for feeding animals through the winter, could not be stored. When summer arrived, the rain continued. When autumn came, there were no reserves. The first harvest failed, then the second, and soon, the entire agricultural system collapsed. Famine rarely begins with immediate death. It begins with choices. First, families reduce their portions. Then they sell tools. Then clothes. Finally, everything. Bread became a luxury. Records show that in some regions, grain prices multiplied 4 or 5 times. In others, grain simply vanished. For most medieval people, living at the edge of subsistence, this meant a slow death sentence. Without enough food, bodies weakened. Children stopped growing. Adults lost the strength to work. Common illnesses became deadly. Hunger did not kill alone. It opened the door to everything else. As 1316 progressed, the crisis ceased to be merely economic and became social. Order began to break down. Parents abandoned children because they could not feed them. The elderly were left behind. The sick were ignored. Solidarity, essential for survival in rural communities, began to disappear. Contemporary chronicles describe something even more disturbing. Documented cases of cannibalism, not as legend, not as literary exaggeration, but as a last resort for people pushed beyond every human limit. Hunger did not only destroy bodies, it eroded morality and shattered bonds that once seemed unbreakable. Meanwhile, Animals were dying as well. Without enough hay, cattle, sheep, and horses did not survive the winter. Without animals, there were no plows. Without plows, no planting. Without planting, no recovery. The cycle of destruction closed in on itself. Less food created more hunger. More hunger weakened the workforce. And without a workforce, the future vanished. Entire villages were abandoned, not because of war or fire, but because their inhabitants died, or left in search of something that no longer existed. Houses remained standing, churches intact, fields empty. In many of these places, no one ever returned. In the medieval mindset, there was no separation between the physical and the spiritual world. A tragedy of this magnitude could only be understood as divine punishment. Preachers spoke of sin, of greed, pride, and excess. Processions moved through towns begging for mercy. But the rain continued, and so did the hunger. When prayers failed, fear turned into quiet resignation. By around 1317, climatic conditions slowly began to improve. The rains eased, harvests returned, but the damage was already done. It is estimated that up to 10% of Europe's population died directly from famine. The real impact, however, was far greater. Survivors were malnourished, physically weakened, and psychologically scarred. Europe had been hollowed out at its core. A few decades later, a new enemy would arrive. Invisible, biological, relentless. The Black Death would find a continent already exhausted, traumatized, and vulnerable. The Great Famine was not an isolated event. It was the first blow, the silent warning, the prelude to collapse. History remembers the plague, the bodies, the visible terror. But before sudden death came slow death. Before open collapse came silence. The Great Famine of 1315 was the moment Europe began to die without realizing it. And when it finally understood, it was already too late. Not every apocalypse begins with screams. Some begin with rain, with empty fields, and with the absence of bread. If you made it this far, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you at home, at work, or traveling along a quiet road? Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. Because more than 700 years ago, people across Europe were doing the same thing, trying to understand how their world had begun to disappear. And if you want to keep exploring the moments when history nearly slipped away, subscribe to the channel. Understanding the past is the only way to recognize when it begins to repeat itself.